Nobody in Cutter's Bend thought Carrie Fenn would last a single winter on the Drummond place. She'd heard them say it. Not whispered, said plainly. The way people in small towns say things they believe to be simply true, like weather predictions or the price of cattle. She'd heard it at the feed store on her second morning there, standing just around the corner of the grain aisle, while two men in dusty hats discussed her, as though she were a new piece of equipment that didn't look up to the job. Big-boned woman like that, soft hands, she's got no business on a working ranch. Wade Drummond's lost his mind since Martha passed. Carrie had picked up her bag of flour and walked to the counter without turning her head. She paid. She thanked the man behind the register. She loaded the flour into the truck bed herself. That was September. She was 29. Not small. She'd always known that, had grown up in a household where her mother called her big girl. The way some people say it like a compliment, and some people say it like a consolation. She carried herself straight despite it, shoulders back, chin level. She'd taught 4th grade in Amarillo for 6 years, and had learned that the surest way to lose a room full of 9-year-olds was to seem uncertain of yourself. She was not uncertain of herself. But she was uncertain of this, of the long gravel road that rattled the truck windows each morning, of the silence that lived in the Drummond house like a fifth person, of 4 boys who watched her the way cattle watch a stranger crossing their pasture, still, waiting to see if she'd do something wrong. Wade Drummond had met her through his cousin at a church supper in Lubbock. He was a quiet man, not cold exactly, more like a house where the fire had gone out and no one had gotten around to relighting it. He was 44, weathered in the way that Texas Panhandle ranchers get weathered, lines carved around his eyes from years of squinting at horizon lines and doing math in his head about things that didn't add up, rainfall totals, cattle prices, the number of hours in a day against the number of things that needed doing. His wife Martha had died of cancer 18 months before. 18 months was not very long. Carrie had known that going in. She was not naive. She had told herself she was walking into something hard, and she had meant it. And then she had arrived and discovered that hard was not quite the word. The oldest was Archie, 17, broad-shouldered like his father, with Martha's dark eyes and none of his father's patience. He did not speak to Carrie the first week. He acknowledged her existence the way you might acknowledge a door that's been left open, aware of it, slightly inconvenienced, waiting for someone to close it. He did his chores, ate his meals at the far end of the table, and left the room when she walked in. Seth was 14 and dealt in silence of a different kind, the deliberate kind, the kind a boy constructs out of pain and holds on to because it's the only thing he feels he owns. He answered direct questions. He said yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, with the mechanical politeness of someone who has been raised right and is furious about it. He never looked at her when he spoke. Nate was 11, watchful and precise. He tracked everything. He noticed when she moved things in the kitchen and moved them back. He said nothing about it, but he put the cast iron skillet back on the left hook every time she hung it on the right one. He left Martha's mixing bowl on its own shelf, slightly apart from the others, and if Carrie ever reached for it without thinking, she would catch his eyes on her from across the room, careful and unblinking. And then there was Rory. Rory was 8. He still sometimes forgot, in the first half-second of waking, that his mother was gone. Carrie could tell because she would hear him call out, "Mama?" in the thin light of early morning, and then there would be a silence, and then nothing. He never cried where anyone could see him. He had learned that from his brothers. But he was the only one who sometimes looked at Carrie with something other than distance in his eyes, a kind of cautious curiosity, like a dog that's been kicked before but hasn't entirely given up on people. Wade worked from before sunrise to after dark. He was not unkind to Carrie. He thanked her for meals, asked how her day had gone, listened when she answered, but there was something missing from his listening, some fundamental layer of presence. He was there and he was not there. She understood it. She did not resent it, but understanding a thing and being unbothered by it are different, and she was not always unbothered. She started with the kitchen. Not because she thought cooking would solve anything. She wasn't foolish enough to believe that, but because it was something she could actually do. The pantry was in a sorry state. Half-empty jars, bags of rice left open too long, a shelf of canned goods that someone had bought in bulk 18 months ago and never rotated. She reorganized it on her 3rd day, quietly, not making a production of it. She made a list of what they needed and added it to the grocery run Wade made on Fridays. She also learned that Rory liked peanut butter on his biscuits more than honey, that Seth ate everything on his plate except beets, which he pushed to one side in a neat pile, never complaining, just refusing, that Nate took his coffee with 2 spoons of sugar and had been doing so since God knows when, 8, 9 years old, already drinking coffee the way some families just did, that Archie ate like a man doing labor because he was doing labor, enormous amounts of food quietly and efficiently, and if the food was good, he would stop eating for just a moment after the first bite, almost imperceptibly, before continuing. She filed these things away. She did not make them into conversation pieces. She did not say, "I noticed you like," or try to turn observations into connection. She just knew and adjusted and let it be. The trouble came in October. A man named Dale Cutler, neighboring rancher, big opinion, small patience for things he didn't understand, came over one afternoon while Wade was out fixing fence line and found Carrie attempting to drag a hay bale across the barn floor by herself. The bale won. She was on the ground, covered in straw, breathing hard, when Dale walked in and stopped. He looked at her. He looked at the bale. He looked at her again. "You need help there?" The way he said it wasn't generous. It was the kind of offer you make when you're already planning to tell someone about it later. "I've got it," Carrie said and got back up. "Wade know you're out here wrestling hay." "Wade trusts me to handle things while he's working," she said, which was either true or something she was making true by saying it. She hadn't quite decided. "Excuse me." Dale left. She got the bale where it needed to go. It took her 20 minutes, and she lost 3 fingernails, and she did not say a word about it to anyone. But 3 days later, she overheard Archie on the phone. She hadn't meant to. She'd come in through the side door and the sound carried, and he was telling someone, a friend she supposed, the story. Not cruelly, exactly, but the way boys tell stories that are meant to prove a point. She was on the floor, man. Hay everywhere. What's she even doing out there? She kept walking. She set her grocery bags on the counter. She washed her hands. That night at dinner, when she set a plate of chicken fried steak in front of Archie, made right with cream gravy, the way she'd learned from his father's brief and uncomfortable description of how Martha used to do it, Archie looked at it for a moment. He said nothing. He ate every bite. The tension in the house was like weather. Some days it was livable. Nate helped carry wood in without being asked. Rory sat on the porch steps near her while she shelled beans and talked about his teacher at school, small unremarkable things, and for a little while the house felt like a place that might eventually become a home. But other days it closed in. Archie's silences grew pointed. Seth disappeared for hours into the barn. Wade came in tired and distant, and the table felt like a room where 4 separate people were enduring a meal together, not a family. One evening in late October, she and Archie were alone in the kitchen, everyone else outside or upstairs, and she asked him, plainly, if he would show her how to work the old hand pump on the east side of the barn, because it kept sticking. He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not going to be here long enough for it to matter," he said. He said it without heat. That was worse. It was a statement of fact. Carrie looked at him for an equal moment. "Might be," she said, "might not be, but the pump still needs to work either way, so." He showed her. He didn't say anything else, and neither did she, and when it was done, he went back to what he'd been doing, and she went back to what she'd been doing, and that was that. November arrived. The first hard norther came the second week of the month, the kind that rolls in fast off the panhandle and drops the temperature 30 degrees in 4 hours. Wade had driven to Lubbock that morning for a parts order he'd been waiting on for 3 weeks. The kind of trip you can't delay because the part you need is the only thing between you and a broke-down tractor in calving season. He'd meant to be back by 4. At 2 in the afternoon, the sky turned the color of a bruise. By 3, the roads were ice. At 4:30, Wade called from a truck stop outside post. He wasn't going to make it back until morning. The roads were closed. Carrie stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand and listened to the silence of the house around her. Wind pressing against the windows, the creak of old wood, 4 boys upstairs or out in the barn. She put the phone down and went to find them. She found Archie in the barn, already aware. He'd been checking the weather on his own. He had that expression that teenage boys get when they're scared and will not show it. Jaw set, eyes too steady. "Roads are closed," she said. "Your dad won't be back until morning. I need you to tell me what needs doing." He blinked. That was not apparently what he'd expected her to say. She had not said, "I'll handle it." She had not said, "Don't worry, I've got this." She had asked him. She needed him to know the ranch, and she did not. Something shifted in his face, barely visible. He told her. The next 3 hours were the hardest of her time on the Drummond place. She and Archie moved the cattle into the lower pasture together. Seth, unprompted, came out and helped with the horses. Nate checked the water lines. Rory, because he was 8 and small, was given the job of keeping the fires stoked in the house, which he took with dead seriousness. By the time darkness came down hard, the animals were in, the pipes were wrapped, and all 4 boys came into the kitchen cold to the bone. Carrie had a pot of chili on the stove. She'd started it before they went out. Simple, enough to feed everyone, warm. They ate without the usual careful seating arrangement. There wasn't room for it. They just sat where they landed, and Rory ended up next to Carrie because the chair was there, and Seth poured everyone water, including her, without thinking about it, and Archie ate 2 bowls. When they were done, Rory said, "It smells like Mama's kitchen in here." Nobody moved. "The chili?" Seth said. "No," Rory said. "Just in general, the kitchen." He said it without any particular sadness. He was 8. He said the true thing. The rest of them sat with it. Carrie didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. Later, after the boys were in bed, and the house had settled into the sounds of a cold night, she went to the cellar for another jar of tomatoes for the next day's supper, and found something she hadn't noticed before on the lowest shelf behind a row of green beans, a dozen jars of peach preserves, labeled in a neat handwriting that was not her own. Martha Drummond, August 1998. She stood there for a long moment. She went back upstairs and did not sleep well. In the morning, Wade came home, and the house rearranged itself back into its usual shape. Boys redistributed to their usual distances, Carrie in her usual place at the margins. But something was different, not fixed, not resolved. Different. Archie looked at her across the breakfast table and gave her a nod. Just a nod. She nodded back. The peach preserves sat in the cellar, and she left them there for 2 weeks, because they were not hers to touch, and she knew it. Then Rory got sick. Nothing dramatic, a bad cold, the kind that settles into the chest and makes a child miserable for 4 days. He ran a fever the first night, and Carrie sat up with him, and by the second day he was past the worst of it, but still low and fretful, lying on the couch wrapped in a quilt, not interested in food. She made him soup. He ate a little. She read to him from a book she found on the shelf, some old thing about a boy and a horse, and he fell asleep mid-chapter with his mouth slightly open and his hair damp against his forehead. On the 3rd morning, he woke up and said he was hungry for something sweet. She thought about it. She went to the cellar. She stood in front of Martha's jars of peach preserves for a long time. She took one. She made biscuits from scratch, real ones, the drop kind, fat and golden, and she opened the jar and spread the preserves across the tops while they were still warm, and the smell that came up from the pan was something extraordinary, summer, concentrated, August sealed in glass. Rory was the first one into the kitchen. He stopped in the doorway. His face changed in a way that was almost painful to watch. "Those are Mama's peaches," he said. "They are," Carrie said. "I found them in the cellar. I thought, if that's all right, I thought you might like them on your biscuits." He looked at the pan. He looked at her. "She used to make them when we were sick," he said. I figured it might be something like that. He sat down at the table and she put a biscuit in front of him, and he ate it in 3 bites and didn't say anything. And then he started crying. Not loudly. The way you cry when you've gotten practiced at keeping it small, his shoulders pulled inward, his hands flat on the table, his face doing everything it could to stay still. Carrie sat down next to him and didn't say a word. She put a hand on his back between his shoulder blades and left it there. She heard the creak on the stairs that meant someone had stopped. She didn't turn around. Nate came into the kitchen first. He saw Rory, saw the biscuit, saw the open jar. He pulled out a chair and sat down without speaking. He reached for a biscuit before he'd even properly settled, and then he sat. Seth came next. He stood in the doorway for a moment, cataloging it the way he cataloged everything. Then he came and sat down. Archie was last. He stood at the counter and looked at the jar, Martha Drummond, August 1998, and his throat moved. "There were 12 jars," Carrie said quietly. "I only took the one. The rest are still down there. I thought you boys should decide what to do with them." Archie looked at her. She met his eyes. She spent a whole August canning those, he said. Said she was putting up enough to last us years. She did, Carrie said. He stood there a moment longer. Then he sat down and reached for a biscuit, and she pushed the jar toward him. Outside, the November wind was quiet for the first time in days. The kitchen held all of them. Rory still sniffling, Nate eating steadily, Seth with his elbows on the table in a way that would have gotten him corrected on any other day, Archie turning the jar once in his hands before setting it back down. Nobody got up right away. They just sat there after the biscuits were gone, the way people sit when they're not ready for a moment to end. That afternoon, Wade came in from the pasture earlier than usual. He stood in the kitchen and looked at the open jar of preserves on the counter, and he went very still. Rory was sick, Carrie said. I should have asked you first. I'm sorry if... No, he said. He picked up the jar and looked at Martha's handwriting. He looked at it for a long time. She made those the summer before she got the diagnosis, he said. Said she wanted to put up enough to carry us through a few years. He set the jar down carefully. Boys eat them? Every one of us, Carrie said. Wade looked at the empty pan on the stove. He looked at the jar. He looked at Carrie, and for the first time since September, he actually looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her, the way you look at someone who has done something you didn't have words to ask for. Thank you, he said. It was the same 2 words he said every night after dinner, but it wasn't. The December county fair was the first public thing they attended as a family. Carrie knew what people said. She'd had 3 months of it by then. The glances at the feed store, the particular way women in town smiled at her that meant something other than warmth, the comment she'd overheard at school pickup about Wade Drummond's new wife, delivered in a tone that made the words mean something shabby. She dressed warmly. She showed up. They set up a booth for the ranch's honey. Wade kept bees on the east pasture, a fact she'd learned in October and immediately become devoted to, because the operation was meticulous and oddly beautiful, and it was a clean, organized booth, with labeled jars and a handwritten price card. A woman Carrie knew slightly, Patty Elmore, stopped at the booth and spent 30 seconds looking at the honey, before looking at Carrie and saying, in the pleasant tone of someone delivering a blow they've polished, "It's so nice that you're trying to fit in here. It must be hard, coming from the city." Archie was standing 3 feet away. He turned around. "She's the one who figured out we could sell at the Sweetwater market," he said. "We made $400 last month." Patty blinked. "She renegotiated the contract with the grain supplier, too," Archie continued. "He said it the way he said everything, flat, factual, without particular expression. Saved us about $800 for the year." He turned back to what he'd been doing. Patty bought 2 jars of honey and moved along. Carrie did not look at Archie. She straightened a jar on the table and made a small adjustment to the price card. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "I know," he said. He was watching the crowd, not looking at her, but his voice had lost the careful blankness it carried every other time he'd spoken to her. He sounded, for a moment, like a 17-year-old boy who was tired of being at war with things. "My mom would have liked you," he said, "probably." Carrie kept her eyes on the table. "Probably?" she said. "You're kind of bossy," he said, and then, so quietly she almost didn't catch it, she was bossy too. Wade came back from the parking area and found his oldest son standing next to his wife at the honey booth, the 2 of them not talking, but standing the way people stand when they've reached some understanding, easy, close enough, not watching each other's movements anymore because there was no longer a reason to. He stopped a few feet away and looked at them. Rory came up beside him carrying a paper cup of cider and followed his father's gaze. "They're not fighting anymore," Rory observed. "No," Wade said, "they're not." He walked to the booth and stood behind Carrie, and when Patty Elmore came back around with her sister for a 3rd jar of honey, Wade put his hand briefly on Carrie's shoulder, not dramatic, not performed, just there, solid and warm, and said, "This is my wife." He'd said those words before. He'd used that introduction before. But he meant it differently now. It landed differently. That evening, driving home in the truck, all 6 of them, 4 boys piled in the back bench, Carrie in the front, the dark panhandle sky thick with stars. Rory fell asleep against Seth's shoulder, and Seth didn't move him. Nate had a bag of kettle corn in his lap and was making his way through it with the quiet focus he brought to everything. Archie had his arm propped on the window ledge, watching the road go dark. Wade drove without speaking, but at some point he reached across the console and rested his hand on top of Carrie's, just for a moment. Then he put it back on the wheel. She looked out the windshield at the long, flat road ahead. The house was 40 minutes away, and she already knew it by heart. Which step creaked, which faucet ran cold first, which window let the morning light in earliest. She knew the names of all the cattle Wade kept track of by ear tag number, knew which fields were fallow, knew the east fence needed replacing before spring, and that the wood in the barn was getting low, and that Nate's birthday was December 19th, and that Rory slept with one arm hanging off the side of the bed, and that Seth kept a photograph of his mother folded in his jacket pocket. She knew this place. She had not replaced anyone. She had not tried to. She had just shown up every morning and done what needed doing, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, the house had stopped being a place she'd moved into and started being a place she lived. 11 jars of peach preserves still sat in the cellar, labeled in a handwriting that was not hers. They belonged to all of them now, to the boys who remembered, and to her, who had learned to be careful with what other people loved. There was room enough in one house for both of those things. There always had been. It had just taken a cold November and an open jar and 4 boys sitting down together to prove it. The road stretched out pale in the headlights. Behind her, Rory slept. The kettle corn rustled. The stars kept their positions over the flat, dark land. She was 30 years old, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be.